What's up, Street Talks? This is Eric from the Eric Street Photography blog. So I'm going to start giving you guys a new presentation on how to find your style in street photography. And this is a presentation that could be applied to any sort of photography. And of course, my blog is a street photography centric site. But as time goes on, I'm not only focusing on just street photography, I'm photographing personal photos of Cindy, my loved ones, my friends, which I like to call personal photography. But anyways, if you've ever felt like you've been out shooting a bunch of random photos in the streets and you're looking for more focus, this presentation will help you find, how to find a style, questions you should ask yourself, how to come up with project ideas, and essentially how to publish your work. All the things aren't, right or wrong ways to do things, but they're just practical tips and tricks which have personally helped me, and hopefully these will help give you guys some insight as well. So, first question is, why do you love photography? And essentially, why do you make images? Because there's a lot of photographers out there who, if you ask them this question, or maybe if I ask you this question, they couldn't answer it. And it's a very important question because we often ask other photographers, how do you take photos? Where do you take photos of? What camera do you use? What lens do you use? How do you post-process your photos? What are you on social media and so forth? But no one ever asks the why. And the why is much more important. The why is much more important than the how, because why makes your photography much more philosophical. It makes it much more deep. It makes it much more about how you see the world, and why you make photographs will give you a stronger sense of purpose. I think every single photographer needs to have a sense of purpose in his or her own life. For example, I know some photographers, their purpose is to photograph family events, gatherings, other social events, and when they upload their photos to Facebook or share them with their friends and family, everyone else is so grateful because that photographer documented those moments. Other photographers try to do a much more artistic approach where they're making images that hopefully inspire other people. Then there's a lot of the photographers, like myself included, photography is much more of a personal quest where by making photos of other people, you better understand who you are and how you see the world and what you find beautiful. So if I could answer the question, why do I love photography? I love photography because it gives me the opportunity to connect to the outside world. Even though I'm pretty extroverted and I love people and so forth, I'm actually pretty self-conscious when it comes to interacting with strangers or people I don't know. And so through photography, I'm less interested in making photographs. I'm more interested in making connections. And when I was in university, I actually studied sociology, and sociology is all about studying human beings, societies, communities, and the way we interact. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm probably more interested in sociology, human psychology, and philosophy rather than photography. But I see the camera as my tool to apply my interests to the rest of the world. So if you guys ever ask, Eric, what are you? Are you a street photographer? I'll say, no, I'm a street sociologist. Kind of going back to the previous question, why do you take photos? I think ultimately, if you're taking photos for other people, you're always going to be miserable because you're making yourself a slave to the opinion of other people. Because no matter how hard you try as a photographer, you're never going to get more likes or followers than Justin Bieber, for example. But also, by putting your self-worth as a photographer through how many likes, comments, followers you have, you're never going to be satisfied, and you're always going to be on a treadmill wanting more and more and more. And this has happened to me a lot, in the last 10 years I've been doing photography, where photography first started off as a very innocent pursuit where I was just trying to document my friends, my family, my loved ones, my travels, memories. I started when I was 18. My mom just gave me a small point-and-shoot digital camera, and I just photographed anything that interested me. And learning about the internet and more quote-unquote serious photography was a mixed blessing because on one hand, it did help me make much more interesting images, but on the other hand, it became less about taking photos for myself. It was more about taking photos for other people to say, wow, you're a great photographer. And I had goals and dreams like, publishing books or traveling the world, being a famous photographer and so forth. I've accomplished a lot of my life goals, and I can still tell you that no matter what, you're still going to feel so empty inside. And unfortunately, no matter how many likes or followers you have, those little hearts on Instagram aren't going to keep you warm at night, nor are they going to pay the bills. So nowadays, another big reason why I make photos is I want to make photos that are personal to me, that I'll make I'll look at these photos when I'm on my deathbed and look back at my life and say, wow, I've lived a personally meaningful and purposeful life. And also, photography helps me better appreciate the world, other people around me. For example, one project that I'm working on is called the Cindy Project. Essentially, I'm just making photos of Cindy. I'm currently here recording this video in Garden Grove, Orange County, California, which is the most suburban place in America probably. There's literally no sidewalks, and I haven't been able to shoot much street photography because there's nobody walking on the street. So instead of just complaining, which I did a lot in the past, I just thought, hey, how can I make the best out of my situation and make photos which are personally meaningful to me? That ended up me making photos of Cindy. And so now whenever I'm out with Cindy, whenever we're just doing mundane things, like this is one photograph. I was at my friend's apartment, Gareth, in Amsterdam. We're out, just woke up in the morning about to have a coffee. We're walking down the stairs, and the stairs are really steep. And Cindy's opening the door and saying, hey, Eric, you coming? And I just thought that was just a nice composition, nice leading line. So I just snapped a few photos and I said, yeah. So once again, always ask yourself the question, why do I make photos? Who am I making photos for? What kind of personal meaning or satisfaction does this give me, or purpose? And once you could answer that question, other questions like what camera should I use? Should I shoot black and white? Should I shoot color? What lens should I use? What format should I use? All these questions aren't going to be as important. Another thing to consider when it comes to trying to find your own style in photography is ask yourself the question, what does your photo say about you? Or what do your photos say about you? Sorry, my grammar is not so good. But I think when you're making photos of other people, it's less about it's less about the others you are photographing. It's more about yourself. I think every single photo you shoot is a self-portrait. And for me personally, when I'm out shooting photography, whether it be personal photos of me or street photography or whatever, I'm generally a pretty optimistic, happy person. But at the same time, deep down inside, having studied sociology, I'm quite skeptical and quite cynical about the world, and like maybe a little bit negative or a little bit depressing. And it's a bit ironic because a lot of people look at my photos and say, wow, Eric, I always thought you're a happy guy, but whenever I look at your photos, they're so freaking depressing. And I would agree because I think my photos show of me that I am a social critic, or there's a lot of things that I empathize with people, I feel compassion for people, I feel sad for people. So for example, this is one photograph I shot in Provincetown. And I did this as part of a workshop with David Allen Harvey and Constantine Manos with Magnum. And what I really like about the shot is kind of the sense of nostalgia, the sense of sadness, the sense of longing for the past. I actually met this guy at a bar, talked to him for a while, bought him a few beers, had a few beers with him myself, and he goes over to the jukebox and is about to put money into the machine. And once I saw that, I immediately thought about, Robert Frank, The Americans, which is one of the most classical works done on America in the 50s. And there's a sense of longing for the past. And I think I had my camera on P mode. I shot with a Fuji X-T1, 27mm 2.8 lens. And I shot it in P mode, which automatically chooses the aperture and shutter speed. ISO 3200. Maybe I did -1 or -2 exposure compensation. I must have taken at least 70 photographs, and out of all the photos, this was my favorite because just the light on his face and the look in his eyes, also the way his hand is on the machine. But yeah, so anyways, when it comes to finding your own style in your own photography, ask yourself, what do your photos say about you? So if you're an optimist, do you see the world in optimistic mode? If you're more introverted, do you see the world like a fly on the wall? If you're more extroverted, are you interacting with your subjects? Are you shooting portraits? If you're interested in environmentalism and you don't like trash, are you photographing trash? Are you doing personal projects which have a deeper social purpose for you? And I also think the best photographers are the ones in which you look at their photos and you could tell who they are as a human being through the images they make. So there's been a lot of photographers where I first saw their work and then I met them in person. I'm like, wow, I feel like even before meeting you in person, I know you through your photographs. That's another sign of being able to find your style in photography. So another question is, what are you trying to communicate through your photographs? If you think about photography as a sense of, as a form of visual communication, your photos need to have a purpose and they need to communicate some sort of message to your viewer. For example, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is the importance of working on projects. When we're starting off in photography, and especially in street photography, we're just wandering the streets, snapping random photos of whatever interests us, and we just kind of upload them randomly online, which is totally fine. But I feel like if you want a deeper message in your photography and what you do, it's a good idea to work on a project that has a certain theme, a certain message, a certain sense of symbolism behind how you see the world. For example, one project I've been working on for several years, and I'm still working on it, is called my Suits project. Essentially, I used to work corporate, it made me sad or miserable, and now whenever I see guys in suits, I could feel their pain and misery. And so, through this project, what I'm trying to communicate is, hey look, life isn't all about making tons of money and being alienated at your job, grinding 80 hours a week just to make more money. If life makes you miserable through what you do in your work, perhaps you should either switch your career or try to find some more personal satisfaction and happiness in your life. And essentially, I made the conscious decision when I'm photographing suits. I only photograph suits who look miserable because that's how I see the world. And the more biased and the more opinionated you make your projects and your photos, the more they'll resonate with your viewers. The worst type of photographer is the one I think is too, how do you say, non-opinionated, where their photos are just boring. They don't really say anything. And especially when it comes to political candidates, we always hate the political candidates who have no strong opinions, and the ones that are like flip-floppers. They'll be like moderate on all forms of domestic and international opinions, for example. And so there's a lot of guys who work in suits who love their jobs and look super happy and they're driving Ferraris or whatever. But because this project is a reflection of how I see the world and how I felt when I worked corporate, it makes more sense for it to be showing photos of the guys miserable in suits. For those of you guys who are curious of the story behind this photograph, first of all, guess where I was? Yep, if you guys look in the background, you can tell that I'm in Paris. And I'm just on the metro, and around my neck I had my film Leica 35mm lens and flash, and I'm shooting Kodak Portra 400. And I see this guy just looking absolutely miserable during his commute, and I knew that this would be a great photograph. And he's literally within breathing distance away from me, less than arm length away. So I just switched my camera to f16, minimum focusing distance, turn on the flash, adjust the power to about 0.7 meters, and I just crouched down and I made a quick photo. But after I've taken the photo and the flash literally goes right off in his face, I stand up, don't make eye contact with him, and look at the subway map behind him. And I'm pretending like I'm looking at the subway map behind him, not making eye contact with him. Then I take out my phone and I'm pretending like I'm texting or something, and I kind of go about my business, just screwing around with my phone. Don't make eye contact with him for the rest of the trip. And I think he might have suspected that I made a photograph of him, but I assumed that he just thought I was photographing the map behind him. So to transition a little, talking a little more about finding your style in photography. What is style in photography, for example? The way I would personally define style in photography consists of two things. First, it's having a consistent aesthetic, how your photographs look. And secondly, your subject matter, what you decide to photograph or the content. The first thing is aesthetic. So when it comes to the aesthetic, how your photos look, are you shooting black and white or color? Are you shooting digital or film? Are you shooting 35mm medium format, large format? Are you shooting with a smartphone? The tool in which you use isn't so important, but the tool is important because if you want to capture a certain aesthetic, the tool is going to matter. For example, if you want super somber, old school looking photos of people, you might want to shoot with a medium format or a large format camera because it accentuates the portrait of people, the depth of field, having less grain and so forth. If you want to make a grittier, darker, more visceral type of image, then perhaps you want to shoot with gritty black and white. Maybe you should take black and white film and push it to ISO 1600, or if you're shooting digitally, crank up your ISO to 3200 or even 6400 and post-process it in a way which reflects a certain emotion you're trying to get through your photographs. And I think when it comes to an aesthetic, it is important to have a consistent aesthetic, at least across a certain project. And the best analogy, I heard this from photographer Alex Soth, is treat yourself like a film director. Before a film director decides to shoot a photograph, generally they'll say, okay, I'm going to shoot this all in color or all black and white, and they'll stay consistent more or less with their equipment throughout the film. But let's say they create a different film, who knows, they might want to shoot the whole thing on an iPhone or like a 5D Mark 3 or something like that. And so just know that aesthetics could vary within your career as a photographer, but within a certain project, try to keep it consistent. For example, in my suits project, I shot all 35 millimeter lens, mostly with the flash, Kodak Portra 400 color film, and therefore the photo has the same emotion and mood. The second thing is, of course, the subject matter, the content, what you decide to photograph. And so, for example, let's say a photographer is really drawn to faces and portraits. You could say, oh, that photographer's style is they like to shoot a lot of portraits because that's what you see happening a lot in their photos. And as I talk a little bit more through this presentation, I also want to stress the importance that I think in order to find a stronger style in your photography, also having a strong project in your photography or projects in your work, I think these two things are pretty much intertwined, because when you're working on a certain project, you want a certain aesthetic and a certain mood. And by wanting a certain aesthetic and mood, you're going to work on a certain project. To transition, a good question to ask is, why work on a project? So first of all, you don't need to work on a project. Different photographers work in different ways. So if you're a photographer that just likes to go out and shoot random photos of everything and anything, that's totally cool. Because at the end of the day, photography isn't about making the most amazing photos and becoming a billionaire. No. Photography is about making photos which are personally satisfying to us, which enhance our life and our well-being and give a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. For me, I just found a little bit frustrating just going on snapping random photos. There's a certain point where I'm just on the social media treadmill. I go out, I shoot, upload photos on Flickr or Instagram and try to get a lot of likes and keep repeating it. And it just kind of feels a little bit empty and meaningless after a while. And the reason why I wanted to work on a project was I wanted to have a more cohesive body of work, but also wanted my photos to have more meaning and more purpose in them. So I think to work on a project and come up with ideas, I'll talk a little bit of that later, but I'll just kind of skip ahead, is there's many different ways, but I'll just give you guys two different ways you can work on it. First way, you could just go out and just photograph a bunch of random stuff, and then afterwards go to your computer, your Lightroom catalog, and see what kind of reoccurring themes appear in your work. So let's say you like to shoot really dramatic lights, or you like to photograph dogs or old people or cafes. Identify what kind of consistency you find in your work, and then say, hey, look, I find myself photographing a lot of old people at cafes, maybe I can make a project out of that. And then let's say for a month or two, or who knows, years, maybe for the rest of your life, you just go to different cafes and photograph people in the cafes and you're like, okay, this is my cafe project. Another way you could do this, and this will work if you're more conceptual and theoretical, I suppose, is to first start off with a concept, a theme. So let's say, hey, for example, for me, I used to work corporate and I was thinking, okay, how can it made me feel alienated. How can I make a project which is going to symbolize this? And I just thought, oh, okay, photographing men in suits, this might be an easy and obvious one. And it's one of those things where I immediately, let me take a step back. When I first started working on my suits project, I knew I wanted to photograph a concept of a suit, but I didn't really know what that meant. So for example, I photographed some men suit and tie, some with only a suit, no tie, some with only a tie without a suit jacket. Sometimes I photographed women who looked like they were corporate. And essentially I just narrowed it down to a suit must be somebody wearing a jacket and a tie. And by working on this project, once again, it was able to give me much more focus. And the difficult thing about working on a project in terms of starting with a concept and then shooting it is it restricts you. For example, because I was working on my suits project, I knew I could only photograph suits, so I'd only go to parts of town where I knew there were lots of guys wearing suits. For example, financial districts or business areas and so forth. And if I saw something else that weren't men in suits, I'd still make photos, but sometimes that would distract me. Whereas the first approach is just photographing everything in beforehand and then just separating them into different buckets or folders in terms of what's interesting that you photograph. It allows you to have a little more flexibility. And once again, there's no one right or wrong way to do this, and there's many different ways to work on projects, but these are two easy methods which I found that have worked for me and many others. How to come up with project ideas? This is a very good question. And to come up with a good project idea, I think has to be personal. I don't think you should ever ask another photographer, hey, please come up with a project idea for me, because Then you're just going to be doing these boring drills. And I guess it could be a good exercise, but it's not going to have as much personal meaning or significance behind it. I think several questions you could ask yourself. First of all, what are my unique life experiences which have had a profound emotional impact on me? Two, you could even do a project based on an event. So, a friend's wedding, your own wedding. This is actually something I did. Or photographing funeral of a family member. This is also something I did. Another way to come up with a project idea is, you could just think, what kind of photos do I want to make that my future grandchildren would appreciate, or even what I would enjoy to see in the future. So, for example, my current project, the Cindy project, I'm essentially photographing my entire life with Cindy. And now, this can be a lifelong project, is I'm never going to finish it because one day I'm going to die, then I guess it's going to be done. I want my viewers, as well as my future children, to look at my photos of Cindy and say, wow, Eric lived a personally meaningful and loving life with Cindy. And hopefully I want that to inspire them. But coming up with project ideas, I would say kind of don't force it, because on the opposite hand, I know a lot of photographers could get really stressed out because they're always thinking, I need to work on a project, I need to work on a project, I need to work on a project. But if I feel like if a project idea doesn't spontaneously come to you, you shouldn't really force yourself to work on a project. You should let it come naturally to you. So I'm going to transition. How I came up with some of my project ideas. So one of my projects was my grandfather's series, and it's once again going back to just use personal events in your life to document. One day I was in East Lansing, Michigan, and get a call from my mom. Says my grandfather passed away. He was 92 years old, lived a pretty long life, which I was grateful for. And one of the things was, I didn't really know my grandfather all that well, but I knew he was a very distinguished man, and I had a lot of respect for him. And I just thought to myself, I want to use this opportunity to maybe get to know him a little bit deeper by photographing his funeral and my different family members. And so for the trip, I packed a Ricoh GR1V film camera, and I think about 8 rolls of Neopan 400 film, which I pushed to 1600, which adds more grain and contrast in the images, because I kind of knew that, and this is kind of a cliche, but if you want to have a photos that's much more nostalgic or timeless, generally I think black and white tends to work for that, especially with photos which are a little bit more sad or melancholy. Of course, not always the case, but I did that. Anyways, get on a plane and essentially documented my own grandfather's funeral. And for me, it was a very personal and meaningful experience because it helped me get closer to my family, be a lot more present when it came to observing the funeral. And a lot of people ask me, well, 2 questions. First of all, how did my family react because I was photographing my grandfather's funeral? For the most part, they're all totally cool with it because they knew that I was the family photographer and I was part of the family, so I had an in. But at the same time, there are certain things I was not allowed to photograph. So for example, when my family first opened up the casket and my entire family looked at my grandfather, I was not allowed to take a photograph of that. And they made it very clear, and I put away the camera. So know that, and the lesson for me was, sometimes there are situations in which being a respectful and courteous and compassionate human being is more important than being the world's greatest photographer. So sure, it might have made a good photograph, but I had enough respect for my family that I just simply put away the camera. Second thing was a question that a lot of people often ask me is, like, kind of what are the ethics behind it? Like, by me being the photographer, I wasn't really able to be a loyal grandson to really pay attention to what's happening and so forth. I think it comes in different ways. For me, during at least the funeral, I actually did feel a lot more connected to my grandfather because I had a mission to kind of, I guess, preserve his legacy. And I use this project as maybe self-exploration to understand my connection with my grandfather, but also who my grandfather was to other people. So I feel like at the end of the day, ethics comes down to the person in terms of how you personally feel about it. So as long as you feel right in your heart that it's okay, I think it's fine. And I'll show you guys the photos behind my grandfather's series. Let's see, grandfather. Okay, here goes. And also for those of you guys who know Korean, I call this my 할아버지 project because that means grandfather in Korean. So first what I want to do is I'll just kind of flip through the images one by one to kind of give you a sense of what the project is. All right, so let me give you a sense of the logic behind the sequencing and how I put together this project and what was on my mind. So first of all, when I was working on this project, not all these things are in chronological order. So for example, this is another funeral, another mass we had about a week or two after my grandfather's funeral. And I just saw the dove on top of the altar and Jesus Christ. We're Catholic. So I just thought, and I made this image, and I thought this would be an appropriate image in the beginning of the project because it kind of sets the stage and the emotion behind the scene. I first start off by exploring, I guess, the precursor to my grandfather's death. So this is actually where he received hospice care in his home before he passed away. And turning to the right, this is actually the right side of this wall. This is a portrait of my grandfather when he was a younger man, and you can see the one of the crosses in the center of the room. And also one detail which I liked was the little eye reading chart on the right side. So I guess even as he was getting older, he was always testing his eyesight. And I feel like when you're working on a project, not every single photo needs to be an in-your-face, crazy action shot, but I think often working on these more quiet, more meditative, more contemplative images, it really sets the stage for a much more somber project. Skipping ahead, this is a Korean tradition where the night before my grandfather's funeral, we actually spend the night in this one room with my grandfather's body in the casket in the background. And if you look at this photo, just think about what is the detail you find interesting. So for me, it's on the bottom right corner. It's actually on the bottom right corner is my mom, and up right above her is my aunt. And you can see them kind of taking a nap. And I didn't know this when I took this image, but what I noticed afterwards was, to me, is like a bit of a precursor to before they passed away, or to know that. Let me take a step back. A metaphor that one day my mother and my aunt and my other loved ones are going to pass away. So it's kind of like a meditation on death. And when you're working on a project or any sort of photography, meaning I don't think is always ascribed to when you make the photograph. Often you'll discover the meaning after you've made the images. The photograph after this, this is actually the moment where I wasn't allowed to take a photo. This is the moment they're first opening up the casket to see my grandfather's face, and you can see the man in the center is my oldest grandfather, my oldest uncle. He says, "Eric, this is the only moment you're not allowed to take a photo." So after taking this photo, I immediately put away my camera, and my family started to cry. To transition, this is kind of a photo that disorients the viewer. They're like, "What is this?" This is actually the back of the hearse, where they put the casket of my grandfather's body. And I shot it with a flash. And to me, I just thought this is kind of like a cool way for my grandfather to go out in style. It's like the car that drives you to the underworld. But I'm like, oh, that's cool. Like on the left and right side, it looks like subwoofers and looks pretty pimped out. And to transition, so you can see this is inside the hearse, and the next shot is outside the hearse. So the hearse is now on the far left. And the interesting thing about Korean tradition is traditionally we have this thing called ancestor worship, where you treat your dead ancestors like spirits, and you put out fruit for them, you light incense and so forth. But nowadays most Koreans are Christian, and my family in particular. And then this is what a lot of Korean Christians do is we'll integrate the customs of ancestor worship, like we're doing right now in the bowing, as well as the Christian part of going to mass and singing praises and hymns. The next shot is transitioning. We're carrying his body and other relics to give to put on top of his tomb. And what I found so interesting about this shot was that little security camera in the top left of the frame. To me, that kind of reminded me of 1984, Big Brother's watching you, and the sky is very dark and gloomy and grainy. And the way I achieved this look was I shot this, once again, black and white film, uh, Neopan 400 pushed to 1600, which accentuates the gray and the contrast. And I actually developed all the photos at home by hand and then scanned them by myself as well. And I feel that by working with film, I felt a lot more personal to my grandfather. Like when I was holding the negatives in my hand, I almost felt like I was holding my grandfather. It was kind of almost a spiritual experience. Like even talking about it right now, I'm getting goosebumps. So it doesn't, of course, matter whether you shoot a film or digital, but whatever you decide to do, keep it personal. Then the transition is another detail shot of the songs that we sing. And the men on the left side, and then the women on the right side. And that's my mother on the right. And after that, I transition into a wide shot. One way to sequence your projects is to think of yourself as a film director where you're panning from close shots to far away shots, to the left, to the right, up, down. And if you look at the camera work of a lot of different movies, you could often find these techniques. And then another close-up shot of this shovel. And to me, of course, the shovel is a strong symbolism of death, perhaps new beginnings. And I shot this as a diagonal composition. And then this is another shot. So my grandfather and my mom, their family, we grew up in Busan, which is kind of the southern countryside of Korea. It's of course much more developed now, but this is a small village in which they grew up. And so in the middle is my lovely mother. In the center is where my mother's home used to be. And it's, to me, once again, a very nostalgic image which evokes the past. And my mother is, second to Cindy, of course, one of the most powerful and influential women in my life. She has more or less raised my family as a single mother, made so many personal sacrifices, and somebody I deeply adore and love. And I feel that, like seeing this image kind of blew my mind because that plot of land in which my mom's family grew up on is so tiny, and I can only imagine there being like 5 or 8 kids just kind of grow up in that small spot. So once again, a photo that's personally meaningful to me. And as the project is coming to a close, one thing I did was in my grandfather's room, this is on top of his shelf, and on top of, in the center, there's a portrait of my grandmother who passed away. You can see all these Catholic, you got Mary, you got Jesus on the cross, also another family portraits and so forth. And I just thought to myself, because this is a personal project, why not include myself? So you can see the little self-portrait of myself right there. And probably a few weeks after my grandfather's funeral, I was actually up in Seoul with my grandmother, and the cherry blossoms were starting to bloom. And I just thought, wow, this is such a beautiful moment, click. And afterwards, when I'm editing down this project, I just thought to myself, kind of a cliche ending perhaps, but, with death comes new life. And this is a project which, I wanted to be a lot more optimistic and tuned towards the end. And there goes the dog. So one of the big problems about doing presentations at home is dealing with the crazy dogs in the background. So we're going to, as the dogs go crazy, I'm going to sip my coffee and wait for them to relax. Alfie is the crazy dog. He's like this crazy Shih Tzu. So for the guys who own pets out there, you guys totally understand. Okay. So to transition, choosing a camera / aesthetic for your project. I know this includes me and a lot of other photographers. We're so obsessed about the gear, right? We're always on gear review sites. We're on gear rumor sites. What lens should I buy? What focal length should I buy? Blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, I think the simpler you keep it, the better. It doesn't really matter what camera or lens you have, but just make sure it's consistent. And so these are some generic pieces of advice. So for example, if you're working on a project with urban landscapes, the cliche is to shoot medium format film because you can put your camera on a tripod, it's a lot slower, it conveys a lot more information. If you're shooting portraits, use a camera or lens that allows you to focus closely. But then again, I think if I could give you guys a practical tip is the camera and the lens and the aesthetic is probably not going to be as important as the content of your project. So for example, I was really drawn to people's faces. I wanted to feel a sense of intimacy, and I shot these all on a digital Ricoh GR camera, which by default has a 28mm lens, and is not exactly the most flattering lens to use when it comes to shooting portraits, because it distorts people's faces, it makes it look wonky, and you have to get ridiculously close to people. Because most people say if you're gonna shoot portraits, you should shoot with a 50, an 85, or something longer. But I think this is what helped give my project a certain unique aesthetic. And I shot most of the photos P mode, ISO 800, shot raw, flash, and I post-processed them pretty consistently. And almost all of them are shot vertically. So if I could show you some photos from my, it doesn't have a really proper name yet, but I just call it my Bay Area color project. And I'll just kind of show you guys some images. So first let me scroll through the images, and what I tried to do this project was find interesting people with interesting faces, colorful backgrounds. You can see within the project I used all the same camera, shot it often from low angles, framed it pretty similarly, all vertical shots. And this is a maybe shot. I don't know if I'm going to keep this one. Quite like this one. And so my favorite shots. Another shot. So I try to do a mix of ethnicities, male and female, different ages. I actually noticed that I kind of gravitate more towards older people or middle-aged people, because I think there's just much more interest in textures and the faith and so forth. And so you can see all these shots, I've either asked for permission, and when I'm making images of them, I try to elicit some sort of reactions out of them or something like that. All right, to continue, how to overcome setbacks in your projects. So when you're working on a project, one thing you'll often encounter is there's going to be a point at which you're like, I'm bored of working on this project. I don't know if I have any more steam. I don't know when I should finish it. For me, my suggestion is consider a setback as a chance for you to really examine your project. So I get this from my buddy Charlie Kirk. It says, once you encounter some resistance, that's the moment you have to kind of push harder. It's kind of like going to the gym is, if you're working out, the moment when you don't think you could push any more or do any more, you could still do more. And by pushing yourself in deeper, you often get more passionate about your project and find deeper meaning in your project. That's one technique. On the other hand, I know other photographers like the Magnum photographer Christopher Anderson to finish a project is once you no longer love it anymore. And there's lots of different philosophies on this, obviously, but if you no longer have a natural passion and a drive to work on a project, and it feels more like a chore than anything else, I think that's also a good sign to stop working on a project, because I think we should only work on projects which are personally meaningful and things that give us meaning. If it becomes like another job, like having another 9-to-5 job, I feel like that's not what photography really is about. So once you approach a roadblock in your photography, once again, two things you could consider is, what is my roadblock? Why am I having this roadblock? Should I perhaps add more variety? Like if you're working on a project, should I try to photograph different subjects, or should I go to different places in town to add variety? Or is this setback a sign for me to just kind of end the project? And that kind of goes to, when should you finish your project? There's different ways to know when to finish a project. Some of them you could just predetermine a time, saying, hey, look, I'm about to leave to South America in a month and I only have 2 months left in Los Angeles. I'm just going to do a project about my last 2 months in Los Angeles, and then that's your project. Or let's say you're traveling to Tokyo, you're only in Tokyo for a week. I'm only going to photograph Tokyo for a week. That could be your project. Or it could be something like, I'm going to work on this project for 10 years, and after 10 years, I'm going to publish it, make a book, something like that. And I think there's no rigid answers in terms of when you should finish your project. My suggestion is just kind of follow your heart. If you're the type of photographer that you never have conclusion on anything that you do and you want finality, perhaps you should just set a preordained time limit, or the time you live in a certain political or a certain location. Another thing we could talk about is how to sequence or edit your project. So let's say you're working on your project, you photographed everything you need. how are you going to sequence and edit your project? And when I say edit, I don't mean post-process. I mean deciding what to choose or keep. There's lots of different ways to sequence and edit your project. The way that I hear a lot of photographers do is they'll first get down to, let's say they're working on a project for several years. Let's get down to like 200 images or so. They'll print out small 4x6 prints, and they'll do it by hand, because if you have prints in hand, there's a stronger connection you feel with the images. And also you could sit down with other photographers and say, hey, can you help me make a stack of images? The keep pile and the ditch pile. And if you ask enough photographers to do this, oftentimes you'll see commonalities. Another tip is when you have a bunch of 4x6 prints on the table, you could kind of shift them around, shuffle them around, and you could start seeing different connections between photograph A and photograph B. And you could use a lot of randomness and serendipity to make these kind of connections. Other ways you could do it is you could sync your photos on Dropbox, your iPad, your smartphone, and you could kind of rearrange your photos as you see fit. And another thing I want to talk about is the limit of projects, because I think if you have a project that has like 100, 200 images, that's just too many images. I think less is more. So I think a sweet number is, let's say, if this project is for your website, keep it around to 10 to 15 images. I think anything more than that is a little bit overwhelming. If you're going to do a photography book, I think 40 images is kind of a good number. If you're doing an exhibition, it depends on the gallery size, but you could have as few as 3 or 5 images. And depending on how much space you have, you could add more images. But I feel that when you're creating a project, less is more. And often when you're working on a project, there's a good way to have a sequence and a flow to the images. And honestly, it's more like poetry than a hard science. So you could kind of create a fictitious narrative in your head saying, oh, this, and think about film once again. This is the establishing shot. This is the protagonist. This is a secondary character. These are the details. These are the conflicts. This is how it got resolved. This is what happens afterwards. This is the conclusion. This is the aftermath. Different ways you could sequence edit that way. And let's say you finish editing and sequencing your project. How to publish and promote your project. This is a lot of things that a lot of people ask is, okay, let's say I have this body of work. I photographed this small town in my neighborhood, and I want to publish the project. So there's different ways you could do it. You could do it as a zine format, a magazine format. I'd recommend just go on blurb.com, print it out that way. You could just go to FedEx or Kinko's, just print them out as Xeroxes, staple them together, black and white or color, whatever you want. You could publish a book. You could either self-publish it yourself, promote it, or get it done by a publishing house. Or you could do it as an exhibition. You meet people who have galleries who are curators. You could also publish it just on your website portfolio. I generally think it's a good idea for every photographer to have an online presence. And an easy thing is just first name, last name, photo.com. Different ways you could show your work, different services, which are paid, include Squarespace, Format, SmugMug, and so forth. If you want self-hosted options, I personally use something called Koken, Koken.me. It's open source and free. Actually, I'm not sure if it's open source, but it's definitely free. And you can just install it on your own server and buy your own domain name. So first name, last name, photo, or photography.com. So mine is simple, just erickinphotography.com. Try not to make it like, dark, mysterious photo.com. Like, that's kind of cheesy. First and last name makes it easier for people to Google your name. And I think when it comes to publishing your work, think about who your audience is. So for example, if your audience is your local community, perhaps printing them as small magazines or pamphlets or booklets and just handing them out. That's a good way to publish and promote your project. If, let's say, you want a larger audience to see your work, perhaps you should publish and promote it over the internet. So email other photography bloggers. Let's say you could attach 5 photos from your project. Say, hey, my name is Eric. I'm working on this project on X, Y, and Z. Here are some photos from my project. Would you be interested in publishing this to your blog or your website? And at the end of the day, this is one thing I've discovered for myself. It doesn't matter how many people look at your project. What matters more is the people which you attend to see the work. And it doesn't matter if you had 1 million photographers look at your work, 1,000 photographers, 150, 10. As long as you made a project that has brought personal meaning to yourself, I think that's enough. Or brought meaning to at least one other person. So even something simple was I did a photography project of just documenting my mom and Cindy's mom's travel through Europe last summer in 2015. And I just made a small little blurb book and just gave it to them, and it brought them so much joy and happiness. And essentially, the audience was like 2 or 3 people. But that's all that really matters, because at the end of the day, we're all gonna die. Everyone's gonna forget of us. You know, why does it matter if you've had millions of people look at your work? Photography, I think, once again, should be personal and meaningful to you. So don't think about how many people you can reach, but whether it could reach the people you want it to reach. And this kind of goes back to something we talked about earlier, is how to overcome photographer's block. No matter what kind of journey you have in photography, you're always going to overcome photographer's block. I think one of the best tips about photographer's block is just embrace it. That if you've kind of hit a block in your photography, sometimes it's good to just put your camera to the side, put it on the shelf, and just take a break from photography. Pick up other forms of art, so like music, painting, drawing, sculpture, dance, theater, rap music, quilting, whatever it may be. And I think at the end of the day, once again, we don't need to be photographers as long as we're artists of life. Whatever artistic, creative medium we have, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of photographers who get bored of photography and pick up filmmaking, and vice versa. And that's one way to overcome photographer's block, is to embrace it. And let's say you never get back into photography. Maybe you weren't intended to go back into photography. Other ways you could overcome photographer's block, different strategies. I think sometimes just using the most simple equipment will help you overcome photographer's block, because let's say you have a big full frame DSLR with huge lenses. It's kind of a pain in the ass to carry that with you everywhere you go. And the heavier and bigger and more cumbersome your camera, the less likely you are to make photographs. So just choose the most simple, down-to-earth equipment, so a small compact point-and-shoot camera, or just even using a smartphone. And just photograph anything that just catches your eye. And get rid of the self-censor you have in your head that says, oh, don't take a photo of that, that's boring, no one else is going to find that boring. As long as you have a gut feeling that this might be an interesting photograph, just shoot it. And we're kind of coming towards the end of this presentation. You know, from the beginning of this project, talked a little bit about street photography. Now what I'm starting to transition is more on this concept of personal photography, that you're making photos which bring you personal satisfaction and meaning, rather than making photos that's going to please millions and billions of people. And personal photography is photos that are just personal to you. So it could be landscape, it could be people, it could be urban landscapes, it could be street photography. Personal photography is much more inclusive than it is excluding. And once again, because I don't really have the opportunity to go out shooting the streets that much, at least when I'm in the suburbs, I just photograph what's at hand. So for me, that's photographing Cindy and documenting my love of her. And one project that I want to show with you is actually photographing my own wedding day, which is pretty fun. And let's see. Yeah, okay, I think this is pretty good. Okay, cool. And also another thing I want to show you guys too is when I'm working on projects, often what I'll do is I'll put it into different versions. So you'll see versions 1 up to different 5. And what I'll do is in Lightroom, I'll put together the different images, and I'll sometimes add images, remove images, and every time I create a different version or edit, I'll just add a different version number. And a good way to know whether a project is meaningful or worthwhile or not is to see how many different versions of it you'll have. So for example, on my American series, I have 16 versions of it. But another project that I'm very passionate about is my Suits project. I have 42 versions of it. And this is not always the case, but sometimes the more versions you have of it show that you somehow have some sort of inkling to the project, so you should continue. Anyway, so this is version 5 of my wedding series. First, I'll just kind of flip through the images and discover, and then just share the rationale behind it. All right, so my apologies. This is actually not edited and sequenced it fully because I have not yet come up with a final edit or sequence. But oh, since we're doing a video, this is always fun. So what I'll actually do is, let's say I open up Lightroom. I'll actually give you guys a quick demo in terms of how I actually might do this in real life. So I have all these images, and one thing I'll do is I'll just import them into Lightroom. I'll just add them to my catalog. So let's see, there we go. So importing it to Lightroom, and this all add, that's fine, so I just add it. And what I'll do is once I have all the images in my catalog, I'll just press Command A to select all the images. And on the left side, I'll scroll down to collections. I'll press this plus button, create collection. Let's say wedding, this is wedding version 5. And oh, I'll show you guys also a cool hotkey is instead of having to click these little things here on the side to collapse these tabs, if you hold Shift and then press Tab at the same time, you automatically collapse all of your sidebars. And so all these, so first of all, me and Cindy, yeah, we got married recently, and I just wanted to make photos behind the scenes and photographing my own wedding because it's obviously one of the most meaningful days of my life. And I feel that photographers or people rarely see the perspective from the couples side of things. And so, you know, I made sure to consult with Cindy, and she was actually thought it was a good idea because we were able to create some intimate and beautiful moments that she was actually appreciative of. So, for example, some of these photos in the beginning, so like this photo, this photo, this photo, this photo, these are all photos I shot before the wedding. These are actually photos of her deciding what dress to choose, going dress shopping with her, and kind of like these little detail shots of her perhaps feeling nervous or, you know, a sense of hope or whatever. And then some other photos were actually shot in a different order. So let's see, this photo. This photograph was actually shot by one of my friends. I think this was actually shot by Grace, one of my good friends. And this is actually shot during our engagement shoot a few days before our wedding. So I'll give you an example of how I might sequence this image, this project. So let's say this photo, I want this last. I'll just kind of drag this at the end. Okay, that makes sense. I like this idea that adventure awaits. And if I just thought about this as a story, this might be a good second to last image because adventure awaits is a good idea. So let's say that's before the final image. So adventure awaits, and then the last shot of me just kissing her, which is quite nice. And then always it's a good idea to think about, you know, what's a good introductory image. Because often I think it's the first image and the last image which are the most powerful. So I actually quite really like this photograph of Cindy because I love it how you could see her, she's reaching out, the finger touching the mirror. And I think it's just kind of a nice elegant shot. It's a good idea for first image. Then this is actually, then I'll make this the second image. This is actually a letter that Cindy wrote to me. And it's just this quick little dialogue that she made for me. And I just think that in terms of a story, I kind of like having there a little bit of text. So I'll read it out loud for you guys. Prologue. A breeze dances merrily between his crisp suit jacket. The sound of soft bubbling from the pond and leaves brushing against each other blend into a melody. It is the soundtrack of quiet joy, honest beauty, and tender love of life and the home that they have built together. Really beautiful and poetic by Cindy. And so perhaps after that, I might have an image which looks a little more pensive. So like this image of her, just the focus detail of just her hand. Then after that, perhaps, what might I do after that? Then maybe I like the idea that I enter the scene because it's Cindy, this story, her fingers together, then maybe her reaching out and shooting my suit. In this, you can see this little selfie of me and her in the church before we're about to walk down the aisle. And let's see, maybe after that photograph, if I want this to be a little more logical, this is just like me looking at my my watch, we're about to walk down the aisle together. And let's see, after that, and then maybe, kind of like this shot. It's kind of a more abstract shot. This is actually, in terms of chronological order, this is her dress that she used to dance in, which I quite like. But it kind of doesn't make sense because it's not the same as that one. So maybe I'll put this a little bit towards the end. So this kind of photo of her dancing in her other dress is before the adventure awaits and then the final kiss. So I'm like, okay, maybe that makes more sense. So let's see. Me checking the time. Then maybe of Cindy looking at herself in the mirror, kind of like that. Cindy. Then maybe the next shot is Cindy looking back at me. Or maybe even a photo of Cindy flexing in the mirror. But then I feel like the flow doesn't work. So often when I'm doing this, it's kind of based on instinct and gut. Oh, what should I do after that? Maybe I should do this image. Oh, and also I realized I'm actually missing some images because I think it's not importing suspected duplicates. Oh yeah, okay, oops. Sorry guys. I need to go back to my catalog. We're wedding version 15. No wonder why it doesn't have other images. But I think some of the other images are in the different versions I have. Yep. So some other images that I didn't include. So I'm going to click the image and then hold command. So I like that one. What's what I want to add? My mom looking at the suit. Her with that thing. And then I press shift tab again. I'm going to drag that again to wedding version 5. So essentially what I'm trying to do right now is just add more material. So this is actually version 2 of my wedding photos. So you can just see I've taken tons of different photographs and I've kind of already memorized the images so I kind of know what I want or what I don't want. So let's see, nothing really here. Okay, so kind of gonna press shift tab again, go back to wedding version 5. Okay, so I have a little more fodder to work with. All right. And yeah, as much as I love the shot of my mom looking at my suit, perhaps she doesn't include in the narrative, so I'll just press delete to take that, to get rid of that. And I kind of like this is like a preparatory shot of Cindy using the eyelash trimmer. And here's her eye here. And also I like the tones because here it's quite dark and it's also dark here. So that might transition well. Let's see. And also feel like the shot of me taking off my bow tie, my suit should be towards the end-ish. So maybe I'll put that about there before we start to party. And then I like this, the symbolism of us holding hand with our rings here. So maybe that's before I take off my suit and party. And this is a tricky thing. Okay, so these two photos I really like, but I feel like they just don't really fit into the narrative. So when in doubt, ditch. So I'm just going to delete both of those. Let's see, how many images do I have? Shift tab, 12 selected. Yeah, I actually think it's a pretty good narrative. So shot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Huh, yeah, that actually works pretty good. And let's say even if this is a photo I wanted to get rid of, because like once again I said when in doubt ditch, because I think I kind of know what this is, but it's a bit random. I think other people might not know what it is, so I'll just press delete. Yeah, and so now we're down to 11 images. And yeah, so actually I'm pretty happy with this. So thanks for watching, guys. So let's see how I might export that is press Command A, press Shift Tab to, and then export these images. And what I'll do is I'll put this to, let's see, my pictures folder. And I'll make this wedding v6, subfolder wedding version 6. Also another important thing in Lightroom when you're exporting, remember when you're exporting it, rename it to custom name sequence, or if you want, it's fine. We just custom name sequence. So, um, so Synderic wedding, because that's what we go by. And once it exports, it'll say Synderic wedding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And when we export it, it's going to be in the right order. In terms of image format, we can just keep it original because these images are already post-processed and nothing else needs to do. We'll just export it. So you'll see under my Finder tab, it just exported to wedding version 6. So now all these images are sequenced in the correct order for me to use it properly. So that's just kind of a quick and dirty overview of how I sequence these images for my wedding. So thank you for watching that. All right, so last two questions. Second to last question. Ask yourself the question, what do you ultimately want out of your photography? Because I think we need an end game or to know why you're doing something. Because if you're out just taking photos and not really thinking about it, our lives are going to quickly pass on by. And who knows, maybe we might be on our deathbeds regretting the type of images we made and that it wasn't more personal. So ultimately for me, I want photography to be a personal journey for me to connect more with individuals around me, whether they be strangers or loved ones. And I want ultimately to make images that my viewer will look at. It'll make them feel some sort of warmth or nostalgia or love, happiness, or even empathy for the sad and the misfortunate. And ultimately, I think, even though this is not that important, I want to somehow leave some sort of legacy that will hopefully empower other future generations. And of course, this is a different question for everybody, but perhaps on a notebook or a journal entry, you could just write down what you ultimately want out of your photography. And yeah, last but not least, I'll show you guys some other photos from the Cindy project. So let's see, where we go. Yeah, so this is like the more final version I have so far. So I'll just show you guys the images. And you can see how they're all black and white with a similar gritty aesthetic. And essentially what I'm trying to do is capture these emotions of Cindy in different situations and also trying to incorporate myself into these images. And even something that I've been doing recently is actually starting to incorporate more color images. So I don't know how I'm ultimately going to edit this down in the future, but I made a separate folder of just color images. This black and white, I don't know how this got in there. And still kind of working out the edit. Oh, this is also something you can see. Because I'm shooting this on digital on a Ricoh GR, you can see how I post-process them in different ways to get a different feel. I actually quite like the processing of the last one, but it might not be as consistent as the other images, but I like it nonetheless. This one's pretty wild. Right? But anyways, yeah, so that's all I have for now. So yeah, I think, so moving forward in terms of finding your style in photography, just to a brief recap, I think try to have a similar aesthetic in your work. I think less is more. Try to stick with one camera, one lens, one post-processing style for a long time. Have a consistent aesthetic. B, try to find a subject matter or a project or a theme which you are personally passionate about. Something that's personal to you. And know at the end of the day, photography is a personal journey and it's less about photographing the lives of other people, but seeing your life reflected through your subjects. And remember, all photos are self-portraits. And if you want a simple project to work on, if you have a partner, a child, somebody who you love, just do a project on a family member. Or if you have nobody else, you could just do self-portrait series of yourself. Other project ideas you could work on is doing street portraits, just approaching strangers, asking to shoot their portrait. You could do maybe a project on juxtaposition, so go out and shoot in the streets, look for interesting billboards or signs, and just wait for people to walk into the scene. There's so many different projects you guys could work on, maybe just capturing dramatic light, so only shoot sunrise or sunset, or maybe another project working on different layers. So there's so many different projects and themes you can work on out there, But once again, make it personal, make it something that brings you personal meaning, and disregard everything else. So thank you so much for watching this presentation, guys. Once again, shoot the streets, drink a lot of coffee, be happy and merry. Until next time, peace out.